good. Okay, here are 3 questions. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes for each. So you should not answer them right away because you may have to think a little bit about that. So the first question sounds like this. Try to remember and describe a grammatical rule you learned in the classroom or from a book when studying a foreign or second language. To what extent do you think the rule was useful when you needed to carry out conversations in that language? So the important thing here is the connection between a particular grammatical rule and your actual use of the language, okay? So please think about the first question. You're gonna get a couple of minutes and then I'm gonna ask you directly. Okay, guys, time is up. So, Devindi, your answer. What do you say?
Present perfect continuous. I studied that in the classroom. But after I moved here, I actually had to use it. So back then I just studied the rule, but I didn't know how to use it in a real context. But after I moved here, like I've been living in America since 2017. So I was able to get the practical use of it.
So you mean that you had certain rules that you learned in your own country, and then you had the opportunity to actually use them in conversation, so activate them. Were you aware of the fact that, okay, I learned that rule and now I have the opportunity to use that?
Yes, of course.
Can you tell me an example?
So how long have you been living here? So I was able to make use of what I learned back in my country. So back then so in the classroom, we just studied the rule, but we never got to talk. But when I came here, I got the practical use of it. Like I was very excited to use that. Actually, I've been living here since 2017. I've been living here for 5 years. So yes.
Okay, thank you. And let me ask you whether you had some opportunity to learn particular rule in your home country when you studied English, and then you came to America and you realized that there is no rule like that, so people don't use the language that way. Can you give me an example like that? Veronique, you probably have something like that, didn't you?
Probably because I learned British English very formally in France, and some of the words and expressions didn't work here. But with regards to grammar rules, it's been quite a while, so I don't really remember specifically learning rules that I was not able to apply.
I see. Yeah, well, you know, I remember but although it was a very long time ago, but I never forget when I learned conditional sentences in English. So, you have this kind of thing that if I have money, I will buy a car. If I had money, I would buy a car. And if I had had money, I would have bought a car. So that's the way how actually you learn conditional sentences in most of the textbooks, no matter whether they were published in France or Germany or China or whatever, So they demonstrate that basically there are three forms of conditional sentences and different kind of tense forms should be used depending on whether this is unreal conditional or real conditional, because if you say that if I had money, I would buy a car, this is real conditional. But if I say that if I had money, I would have bought a car, so that's an unreal condition. So you learn this rule, and I learned that quite all right, but I don't remember that, I have ever used the third one, the unreal condition, the way. And the other thing is that I learned that you never use would or should after if. That is also something that is in most of the textbooks. In America, all the time, people use should, would after if, So the point is that occasionally, if you do learn a language from a textbook, sometimes you learn rules which are not necessarily applied the way as you learn. But that is still some kind of a support because, there is something true in that particular rule. So as far as the if sentences are concerned, for example, not all of them were wrong that I learned, but a couple of them maybe are not used by the native speakers the way, as you learn in school. Okay, let's look at the second question. It's about
I have something to say on that, number one.
Go Uzo, yeah.
Yeah, so while I was in Nigeria, when I learned English language, though we learned British English in Nigeria, we were taught about some of the rules, like, for instance, that singular verbs take a plural noun, or singular nouns take a plural verb. Yeah, singular nouns take a plural verb. For instance, we are coming. We, plural noun, are coming. I mean, for instance, they play football. I play football. He plays football. So, trying to tell me that he would take the verb plays to make a complete sentence. So when I come into America, apart from school, even within school setting, I see some people say we plays football, he play football, like spoken English is different from when it is written. Yeah. So at first I was like, this English is not correct. And I saw people say the same thing, even on radio. I comes. You see someone say on television or on radio, I comes. I wonder how can one say I comes? That's different from what I learned in the grammatical rules, that I come, he comes, we come, they come, something like that. But in this general balance, I see a mixture of these terms and these verbs. So that's one thing I noticed, different from what I learned from my classroom in secondary school.
Definitely, prescriptivism is one thing and descriptivism is another thing, so we know that quite well. And Leonard Bloomfield, one of the greatest American linguists, said in 1930 that whatever the native speaker says, the native speaker is always right. So he says that if people use that form and they understand each other in a speech community, they are right. So the task of a linguist only to kind of record, describe what kind of forms and what kind of words and expressions and sentence structures the native speakers use. And there is some truth in that. All right, but we teach, so we are teachers, so we try to be as prescriptive as possible, because we hope that there is something that we call correctness, although, it is fading away somehow lately. But anyway, let's look at the second issue, the question that I have there, this is from the book. Also, do you agree with Greg's critique of Krashen's monitor model when he states, the other ideas or hypotheses of the theory are either truisms, you need comprehensive input to acquire a language, or vague and incoherent claims like his I+1 nonsense. Discuss the reasons why you agree or disagree with his critique. So Krashen's monitor theory has been with us for a while, and there are still a lot of references in scholarly works to Krashen, and there is no textbook on second language acquisition that doesn't mention Krashen's monitor theory. So what do you think about the theory as a whole, and do you agree with Greg's criticism? So you have like a couple of minutes to think about it again, and then we'll come back to that. Okay. Yingru, what do you think about Krashen's theory, and what do you think about this criticism?
Actually, to some extent, I agree with Krashen's theory according to my own experience of learning English. First of all, I think the I+1 input theory is quite plausible. Because if you just listen to or read some material which is the same level as you are, I don't think that will help enough. And when I was starting as an English major back to college, even though I have a relatively good foundation of grammar when I picked up in high school, but when it comes to speaking and listening, it's quite weak back to that time. So I'm listening to some BBC News and VOA News. In the beginning, it's quite challenging, but I mean, it's not too difficult for me to understand no word of it, but it's still challenging for me. But after spend a couple of months practicing it, then suddenly I realized that I have fewer problem understanding English at that fast speed. And also, it's kind of like a miracle to me. I found that I feel more comfortable when I begin to speak in English. Like you just unconsciously pick up the pronunciation that you listen to. You involving yourself into that so much. So I think there's some like solid points with Krashen's theory.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody else? Yoon-hee, what do you think? Yoon-hee.
I mean, I agree with the first part of the critique where he's basically critiquing the input hypothesis. Was it input hypothesis? I forget the name of the exact hypothesis, but
yes, that input hypothesis. You're right. Yes.
Right. That's... You need comprehensible input to acquire a language. I mean, that sounds like, yeah, it sounds true enough. I mean, it doesn't it doesn't have to be a theory or a hypothesis. I mean, anybody could agree that you need enough input to acquire language. So,
and it's not true, you know, it's truism, but it's not fully true, because we know very well that it's not input, but it's intake. So input is just the beginning of the whole thing, you know. So of course you need input, because without that, that's truism. Yeah. So the Greg is right. But at the same time, it's not necessarily true, because it's not enough just to have comprehensive input, you know, because you can kind of expose the students to as much input as possible, but they will not take in anything, because they are thinking about the internet or their girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever, you know. So after all, that's another thing. So after there are things that may be true there, you know, definitely, as Yingru said, that the I+1 is something that actually may be true, because if in order for you to have any kind of learning, you have to be challenged. You have to be challenged with something that you have never tried before, because if you are just working with what you have already known, you know, I mean, it's nothing. Learning will not happen then. You know, learning will happen if you are challenged. And as Yingru described, in those circumstances, she was really challenged by the native language, you know, that she listened to. So after all, that's definitely true. Uzo, go ahead. You wanted to say something?
Yeah. So the input, for instance, does it cut across all a spectrum of students? Because there are some students that may have some cognitive challenges, so that no matter the level of input they have, there may be not much impact, if I may use that word.
Mm-hmm.
So that we have consideration for, as much as this could be true for understandable reason, but does it cut across all spectrum of students? Some may have some cognitive challenges or poor environmental conditions that might impair or hinder their level of impact of the inputs.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's look at the last one. So it says, do you consider it necessary to notice a target language linguistic feature in order for it to become intake and ultimately be learned? Can you think of examples from your own L2 learning experiences when noticing led to learning? Can you think of instances when you believe you learned an aspect of L2 without prior noticing? So noticing is very important. We're going to talk about it a little bit. And I just mentioned intake, so please think about it a little bit, a couple of minutes, and I'm going to come back and ask you what your response is. Okay. All right. So let's see. Rachel, what do you think?
I don't have any particular examples from my L2 learning, because all of my instruction was pretty much explicit in a classroom. But I can think of times in my L1 where this would actually apply. I think it is necessary to notice a feature in order for it to be intake and be learned. Because when I was learning English, my native language, there are many, many things that I knew without knowing I knew it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know.
There were many times when I was in an English class and my teachers or professors asked me to use or show an example of a grammatical concept or something, a specific way we used the language, and I didn't have like a name for it. So I didn't know how to apply it when I was being consciously asked to use it. Present participle. I hadn't heard that until that phrase until I was in high school, but I was using all these different forms and tenses of language without knowing I knew them. So I think if you're going to be using the language in an academic setting where you're asked specific terms, then you definitely have to notice and intake it. And I think that having explicit instruction on grammatical structures helps. But I do think there are some things where you can absorb or notice, you can start using a portion of a language without knowing why it's correct.
Yeah, that's a good thing that you added that. Yeah, I mean, what you talked about is basically metalinguistic awareness, the development of metalinguistic awareness, and it happens in your first language as well, especially when you start to learn another language and you realize that, well, there are people who say things in a different way and organize their thoughts in a different way. And the other thing is when, earlier we talked about that, and even nowadays in some schools, there are classes where native speakers study English grammar somehow, and then they become aware of what actually they use instinctively, subconsciously, automatically, after all. But Rachel is right when she says that, after all, noticing is very important as far as intake and learning is concerned, but you can learn things without noticing that you learn them. And this is both true for the first language and the second language as well. As far as the first language is concerned, there is less occasion there because, there you pick up things subconsciously, automatically, most of the time, and awareness becomes or comes only later. As far as second language is concerned, it's the other way around. Most of the time, you have awareness, so you are aware of what you are learning and why you are learning that, and so on. And there is much less learning through not noticing. But the more proficient you become, the more your L2 acquisition process and acquisition use becomes similar to that of the first language, after all. Okay, anybody else wants to add something to this? Okay, if not, then let's go to the new material. We have to kind of cover some of the things that we haven't covered from the book yet. So the next theory that we have to talk about is called the information processing, or the so-called cognitive approach. It is very similar to what the book calls cognitive linguistics. We're going to go to that, but there is not much difference between what we call cognitive linguistics and what we call information processing or cognitive approach, because the emphasis is on the mental processes that basically are used when you acquire a second language. And what they emphasize is that language is a very important or inseparable part of cognitive activities. So language belongs to the group of cognitive activities, and it is inseparable from the others. So after all, it is different from the generative approach where we say that, well, there is a separate linguistic faculty, which is a cognitive faculty, but it is separate from the rest of the cognitive activities, in spite of the fact that there is an interaction between language and the rest of the cognitive activities. So as far as the information processing is concerned, or this approach is concerned, there is no separate language faculty here, you know. So the important thing is about the mental processes that are used in the acquisition process. And however, there are a couple of important things here as far as the processing is concerned, because I think that in your other classes, you may have already talked about declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge, and controlled processing and automatic processing. But these terms and these phenomena are also very important in psycholanguage acquisition. So controlled processing is basically connected with the acquisition of new skills in language learning, and it is usually an effortful process and is limited by short-term memory constraints. And controlled processing is connected with declarative knowledge, which is something that you have learned, something that you can recall from your memory whenever you want to operationalize it. As far as automatic processing is concerned, it occurs when a skill becomes practiced and can be carried out relatively rapidly, basically without any conscious effort and any short-term limitations. And that is connected with procedural knowledge, the knowledge of how to do something. And during procedural, the application of procedural knowledge, you basically rely on your declarative knowledge somehow. This is usually an automatic process. The next theory is the so-called interaction hypothesis, which basically suggests that learning happens through interaction. Well, you know, this is truism for me as well, because, well, you know, we know that very well that without interaction, language learning may not necessarily happen the way as wanted to happen. And the important thing here is, and what Michael Long, who developed this idea, emphasizes most of the time, is that whenever you speak, you modify what you say. You go back and forth, you repeat something, you paraphrase something, and so on. And this paraphrasing, that is so-called recast, is very important in language acquisition, especially in teacher-student interaction, when the teacher paraphrases the student's utterance. So this hypothesis has never been very popular, and people didn't write too much about that, but there were certain issues there that were raised by Michael Long and his followers, and especially two things. One of them, as I mentioned, this paraphrasing, this rephrasing, which is very important in the language learning process, and the other one was the negotiation of meaning. So negotiation of meaning, negotiation for meaning. This emphasized that basically what happens is that people who communicate, they interact in different ways, and they constantly make adjustments while they speak to each other, and that helps understanding. This is also in one way or another truism, you know, because definitely when we communicate and we notice that our partner doesn't understand something, then we try to paraphrase that, we try to negotiate that, we try to say that in a different way, and the back and forth, you know, results in basic understanding. And this approach also emphasized the importance of negative feedback in language teaching, which is needed to call the attention of the learner to the fact that something should be said in a different way. Okay, so there have always been debates about how to correct errors and things like this. And most of the people say that errors should be corrected only when the error that is made actually concerns comprehension. And negative feedback is not very much encouraged in present day language teaching, although I think that there is some room there for negative feedback as well, because learners should know about the fact that certain things just do not make sense the way they said something. So there are these three things that why this approach is important. One of them is the paraphrasing, the so-called recast. The second one is the negotiation for meaning process. And the third thing is the negative feedback. So these are the three issues that I want to call your attention to as far as this approach is concerned. There was the comprehensible output hypothesis by Swain, Merrill Swain, who proposed that having to produce L2 encourages the learner to attend to the language and thereby improve proficiency. Of course, I mean, that was the reason why Merrill Swain called our attention to this, because we had the Krashen's monitor theory that emphasized input. So the importance of comprehensive input, and emphasized the fact that learners should be required to produce only when they are ready to produce. Merrill Swain said that no, we actually have to ask the learners to produce, because that's the best way to improve proficiency. So this hypothesis basically suggested that the demands of producing comprehensible output push learners ahead in their language use and in their language development. So, you know, I mean, both things are very important, input and output, but the most important thing is what is in between, the intake. That comes with the theory of noticing, you know, that was basically put forward by Smith in 1995. And it states that what learners notice in the input is what becomes intake for learning. So the important thing here is that the noticing theory talked about two very important things. One of them was intake. So earlier, people thought that there is a direct connection between input and output. Even nowadays, if you read some studies on second language acquisition, some scholars forget about the fact that there is no direction between input and no direct connection between input and output, because in between there is always intake. Okay, so the noticing theory, the noticing hypothesis was the first that emphasized the importance of intake. However, it overemphasized noticing, because we just mentioned that learning can happen without noticing as well. So it is not just noticing, you know. But definitely the input, the notion of input is very, very important for us. And the second very important thing that the noticing theory called our attention to was salience, perceptual salience. The definition was that salience means the noticeability of a feature. So if a given feature is given more emphasis in an utterance, it is more perceptually salient. So this is what the theory said, and we're gonna come back to that, because I think that the noticing theory has received quite a bit of attention, and even nowadays, you know, there are studies that are connected with the noticing theory, and several people use that as a theoretical framework, and there is nothing wrong with that, because it's quite a well-developed theory. But salience hasn't been worked out very well in that particular theory, because salience is even more important than it was described in the noticing theory. Later, we're going to go back to that. And also, this noticing theory emphasized the difference between implicit learning and explicit learning. But of course, we already knew about that, what the difference actually was between the two. Usage-based learning. This is something that we have been doing nowadays all the time, and usage-based learning is connected with communicative language learning. So it is very important that basically language learning emerges from real communicative events. So language learning emerges when you actually do something with the language. So you solve particular tasks with the language. You use the language because you have a particular goal when you use it. And of course, if you do that, the language emerges from these communicative events. So that is connected with emergentism and connectivism that we already mentioned earlier. The basic difference between emergentism and connectivism is that the followers of these approaches do not talk about any kind of innate language faculty. So they deny everything that the universal grammarians say. And after all, emphasis is on what happens after the child was born, what kind of input the child is exposed to, and what the child starts to do with the language. And they say that language emerges from those community activities that happen with the child in his or her environment. I already mentioned at the beginning that basically the information processing, or the so-called cognitive approach, is connected with cognitive linguistics that emerged in the 90s in the United States, and it is still very popular. I just want to repeat that the difference here is between generativists and cognitivists is that cognitivists say that it doesn't make sense to separate language from the other cognitive phenomenon and other cognitive activities, you know. So language is an essential part of the cognitive system. And after all, you know, everything that happens in language is connected with everything else that is connected or includes the learner's cognitive abilities. And of course, as far as language learning is concerned, they emphasize that there is a very close link between form and meaning. So basically, forms express meaning, and meaning is expressed by forms. But we have known that, I think, even earlier, because we said that the most important thing in any human language is that if we want to express some kind of meaning, we can use a lot of different forms to express the same meaning. And the other way around, a form can express a lot of different meanings. You know, so basically there is not that much new in this kind of approach. And the last one is the sociocultural approach. So be careful, do not mix it up with the socio-cognitive approach. It is a sociocultural approach, and this is the Vygotskian approach, who basically used other labels for his theory, like cultural psychology or cultural historical psychology and several others. The most important thing here is that learning is primarily social and not individual. So we have to put emphasis on the social side of learning. And that's the reason why nobody in America knew Vygotsky for a very long time, you know, although he was translated into English in 1962 for the first time. Nobody paid any attention. So Vygotsky became very popular in America only in the 90s, you know, when educators discovered that basically what Vygotsky emphasized was the social side of learning, and basically his theory put primacy of social over the individual. And we already mentioned that there is parallel thinking between Vygotsky and Gresham, because Gresham talked about I+1 as far as the condition of learning, and Vygotsky talked about the zone of proximal development. Basically, same thing, a very similar thing. So you have to challenge the student a little bit higher of his level of knowledge, after all. And one of the important things that the sociocultural theory gave to language teaching was what we call scaffolding. And this is the role that is played by teachers, peers, and others in supporting the learner's development to get to a higher level, after all. So we use that all the time, and I think that basically that is something very useful, not only in the theoretical side of language learning, but also in practical language teaching. Okay, so I want to stop here. I think I've covered all the theories that we need to know about, and please tell me what you think. So do you have any questions in connection with any of these theories, or you have some kind of doubts or problems?
So, Professor, in the social cultural approach, then zone of proximal development cannot be discussed without the mention of scaffolding.
Yeah, of course.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, it is connected with scaffolding, that definitely. So if you talk about the zone of proximal developments, you have to talk about scaffolding as well, you know, because they are intertwined. And it's another thing that they're not always mentioned together. They are not always mentioned together, you know, although they are absolutely intertwined, I think. Anything else?
Professor, I have a question about the Swan's, that is output hypothesis.
Which one?
That is Swan's output.
Mary Swain's, yeah?
Yes. Yeah. But how can we understand that is kind of comprehensible output? How can we define that is comprehensible?
Okay, all right. Yes, that's quite a question, you know, because we know what comprehensible input is, but we have heard less about comprehensible output. And there is, to my knowledge at least, there is not necessarily a very clear definition of what we understand by comprehensible output. The closest definition of that is that carries a message that goes through, you know, which means that if you actually utter something that carries some message, and that message is understood by the hearer or hearers or the audience, okay? And that is connected with what we said about error correction, basically, that when do you have to kind of correct the output of the student? You have to correct the output of the student when it is not comprehensible, okay? So it should be comprehensible by the target, which is the audience, is the hearer or the hearers, okay? That is the closest definition of comprehensible output. But this theory also is a kind of very much connected with some of the other theories, like even with the usage-based theory, because of course you learn a language if you produce that language, okay? So production helps the development of proficiency in any language. And of course, this element is there not only in this comprehensible output hypothesis, but in most of the theories that we had just discussed. Anything else? Okay, if nothing else, then let's go back to the salience, because salience is crucial, I think, in every single field of life, and it is especially very, very important in second language acquisition. I'll try to explain to you why. So what is salience? This is my favorite picture that I use when I talk about salience. Look at this picture. What comes to your mind when you look at this FCUK? Everybody smiles. You have the dirty mind, a very dirty mind. Absolutely, there is no one who thinks about anything else but something dirty, in spite of the fact that it means French Connection, United Kingdom. Okay, so the reason of the fact that you think of one thing only is because there is an attention bias. So salience is basically attention bias motivated by prior experience. That's the important thing, bias and motivated by prior experience. You have prior experience in everything, so what happened to you before a particular moment, that will affect how you process that happens in that moment. No matter what it is language or some phenomena or picture or whatever. You subconsciously automatically relate your prior experience to what you see, what you hear, and everything. Okay? You cannot deny that. And, this is very, very important in language learning, because this is why you have this strong effect of the first language, for example, when you start to study another language. You just cannot say, okay, let's forget about my first language and focus on this tabula rasa, that I'm trying to acquire, right? It will not work like that. So salient meaning is accessed directly, irrespective of contextual bias. So Raquel Guiora, this great psychologist, cognitive psychologist from Israel. She is a great friend of mine, and I have to tell you that she has dementia right now, so she stopped producing articles, and she has been a wonderful scholar, but not anymore. But she's alive and she's doing fine, but dementia is something terrible. But she was the first who talked about this issue, that basically salience is something that is accessed irrespective of contextual bias. So what she says that it doesn't matter what context you are in, you cannot ignore salience, what comes to your mind first, So what comes to your mind first is something that actually is dominant. Let me give you another example. Second favorite of mine. Here is a conversation. Sam and Andy. So they talk, and Sam says, "Coming for a drink?" Andy, "Sorry, I can't. My doctor won't let me." Sam, "What's wrong with you?" Okay, so this is a beautiful conversation. Everybody understands that. What does Sam mean? Because Andy says, "My doctor won't let me." So Sam says, "What's wrong with you?" What does Sam refer to? Some wants to know what kind of illness, what kind of sickness do you have that you cannot drink? That's what it is. Now, I'm going to change one particular word in this conversation and everything will change, because of saliency. So coming for a drink, sorry, I can't. My mother-in-law won't let me. What's wrong with you? So I changed one word, my mother-in-law, and what's wrong with you gained a new meaning. Okay? So the change triggered the change in something else. So after all, this whole, I do not have that with me but I have a nice sign at Walmart, so I made a picture of that there was a board when I walked into the store, on the right-hand side, there was a board, with all kinds of advertisements and something. And one of them said that girls wanted for different positions. Girls wanted for different positions. Excuse me, that's a terrible sentence. Girls wanted for different positions. I don't know what you think when you hear something like that, but it doesn't matter that it was on Walmart. My dirty mind processed that in only one way. So after all, again, my point is that as far as salience is concerned, you cannot escape that. It's there. Even if you deliberately say, okay, no, I want to control what I think, you cannot. It is so important. And my definition of salience is a very short one: most probable out of all possible. So most probable out of all possible. So it's the accessibility of entities in a speaker's memory and how this accessibility affects the production and interpretation of language. So this is where I had a debate with Giora. We wrote about it several times because Giora emphasized the importance of salience only in comprehension. So her wonderful book, On My Mind, emphasizes the importance of comprehension, so the interpretation. But just think about the fact that if you have salience, which you do, then salience will affect not only comprehension, but production as well. So it must affect your production as well. So it's not enough to write about comprehension only. You have to write about production, how salience actually affects production. And my example about Andy and Sam demonstrates this very well, And here is another example. I wrote about egocentrism. You have to be careful with egocentrism because egocentrism should not be mixed up with egotistic behavior. These are two different things. Egocentrism means that you rely on your prior experience. So your prior experience motivates basically what you say. So egocentrism means that interlocutors, so speakers, activate the most salient information to their attention in construction and comprehension of utterances. Okay, so why is it important? Look at this conversation between two non-native speakers. One of them is a Japanese student, Amiko, and the other one is a Dutch student, Nad. So Amiko says, "Are you all right, Nad?" Nad says, "Never better." Amiko, "You could be better," or "No, I'm all right." So what's going on here? So Nad uses an expression that is basically not very usual. So, it is not necessarily frequently used when someone asks you, "Are you all right?" So Amiko is confused because she doesn't understand very well what Nad means by that. So there is some, that expression is something that created some confusion in Amiko because of its saliency for her differs from what was salient for Ned after all. So there is a slight misunderstanding between the two, and that slight misunderstanding is because of saliency. So, as I said, salient meaning is something that comes to your mind no matter what. And the important thing is with salient meaning that it changes both diachronically and synchronically. Just think about expressions like piece of cake or cool or gay, and several other expressions which used to have different meanings. So piece of cake nowadays, if you say to a native speaker this expression without any context, any actual situational context, that person will understand piece of cake only in one way, easy, you know? And the same thing with cool, because cool original meaning is a reference to the weather, reference to something, you know, that is not warm, but cool. But nowadays, you know, it is like a slang word, you know, and everybody uses that in one meaning only. And the most salient meaning is one thing. The graded salience hypothesis that Giora talked about basically says that this highly salient information is processed first, no matter what. And if mismatch occurs between context and salient information, adjustment is made. So, but the important thing that we should understand here, and what is important for us as people who are interested in second language acquisition, is that context cannot help. So we have to revisit what we think about the effect of context, because when you teach a language, you always talk about context, how important context is to kind of give a particular meaning to the linguistic side. A lot of scholars, Wittgenstein, Bakhtin, and others actually talked about the fact that there is no meaning without context. So the linguistic sign gains meaning in context, which is most of the time true. However, we know that many, many times it happens that expressions make their own context. You know, so there is nothing like something without context. Because if there is no actual situation in context, then the expression that you hear, the expression that you read, and you think it is without context, it creates its own context. You know, so it creates its own context after all. So if you have a clean sheet and you write on this sheet, it's not my cup of tea, and show it to Rachel and ask Rachel, what comes to your mind, Rachel? She will not think about tea at all, because her most salient meaning is entirely different, you know? And that's the reason why actually a lot of scholars who dealt with meaning and said that what we always do is to rely on literal meaning, and based on the literal meaning as a second step, we go to the actual situational meaning. So first we process the literal meaning, and then we make an adjustment based on the context, you know, and then figure out what actually the expression is. But it doesn't work like that for first language users. Why? Because first language users rely on the most salient meaning. And it doesn't matter whether this is figurative or literal, you know. It can be literal, it can be figurative, like in the case of it's not my cup of tea, it's the figurative meaning that comes to your mind first. Or there are a lot of factors that affect your salience, your private experience. So your private experience can kind of modify. So you know, your private experience may be positive with something that usually negative. You know, I don't have the slide here, but one of my favorite examples is from a British sitcom when two ladies are talking, you know, Jill and Jane. I think that was the name of the two ladies. And Jill says something like this. I met someone yesterday. I met someone yesterday. You know, and the other woman says that good for you. And then he said, Jill says, he's a police officer. And then the other one asks, are you in trouble? You know, so what is interesting here? Because, you know, if you start a conversation in English, no matter whether this is British English or Australian English or American English, a woman starts a conversation like, I met someone yesterday. That means some kind of romantic, whatever is included. So it's there, it's included, you know, it's salient in the expression. So when she says, I met someone yesterday, and then she says, he is a police officer. And what about the other woman? So, you know, the other woman thinks that they basically as people in the community. If you mention policeman, policeman is related with some trouble, you know? So that should be some trouble. You know, however, for the first woman, policeman is perfectly positive because of the utterance that she said that I met someone yesterday. So she means that she didn't meet him because she caused an accident in the street or whatever. So the point is that there are differences between private experiences and what is salient for one person, and it may not be salient for a private person. So I talk about, Georg doesn't mention that, but I talk about collective salience and individual salience. So we have to make a difference between collective salience for the speech community general, and your salience as an individual within the speech community, which can differ from the collective saliency of the speech community. So this is where the second language comes in. Because if you read the article, you know that there are three major conclusions there. For native speakers, both literal and figurative meaning can be salient. But for the second language, it is usually the literal meaning that is salient. So that comes to your mind first, no matter how proficient you are in that language. Sometimes, of course, you know, because if you live in a speech community for a longer time, then your saliency becomes similar to the collective saliency of that speech community. Okay? The more proficient you are, the more you are exposed to the target language culture and so on, then your saliency will change and will become closer to the collective salience of that speech community. But otherwise, when you start to learn a language, you know, you have not that collective salience, you have the collective salience of your own language. So when you look at the linguistic science in the other language, you know, what is most salient for you is the literal meaning, not necessarily the figurative, because you do not necessarily know most of the time what the figurative meaning is. So you need more and more exposure to the second language in order for you to kind of go closer to the saliency of the speech community that is represented by the second language. There is another very important thing. The salience is culture specific. So it's absolutely culture specific. What people think about certain issues, certain phenomena in the environment, in the world, and so on. So depending on your cultural, how your mind is wired culturally, of course, you know, that will affect very seriously what you find salient in language and in the outside world. And the third thing is the role of context. So we have to revise our understanding of context, because when we talk about context, it's usually the actual situation and context that we mean. But we should not forget about prior context, you know, that is connected with saliency. So context has two sides, actual situation context and prior context. And they all affect your behavior, communicative behavior. The question is to what extent, you know? So they are always there, both the actual situational context and the prior context. And the question is to what extent. This is, you have to imagine that like a continuum, you know, there are two sides of this continuum, and then you move on that. Sometimes the actual situational context, most of the time, overrides the prior context, but the prior context also can affect very seriously what you think in communication, and it is not only in first language communication, but in second language communication as well. Okay, so I want to stop here and give you the chance to ask questions if you have any. So just one more thing, as far as context is concerned, because there is nothing wrong in when you teach words and expressions in context, because the context specifies the meaning of that word. But you have to think about the fact that it narrows down the meaning of a linguistic expression if you use it in a particular context. And it is dangerous also as far as language learning is concerned, because the learner may think that that's the one and only meaning of that expression that is in that context. And that's the reason why in the case of polysemic words and expressions, and most of them are, you want to show your student another occurrence when the expression is used, maybe in another context, you know, with a different meaning. So we have to be careful when we teach, because students may think that, well, that's the one and only meaning. No, most of the linguistic science are polysemic, so they can have not just one meaning, but several. Okay, questions? No questions. So everybody is familiar with salience. Devin, do you understand it very well? Yeah. There is no problem?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, good. Okay, so what we're gonna do now, we're gonna have a break right now, and then we come back and we focus on the midterm after the break, okay? So right now is important, because before this period of time, basically students work with concrete concepts, and that's one of the reasons why children until the age of 8 and 9, you know, they can pick up the language like this, you know, without asking nasty questions from the teachers, and without even thinking about why these people say what they say the way they say it. And the other thing is the articulation. So your articulatory base becomes stiffer around the age of 9 or 10. So after that, it's very difficult to develop new sounds. So if you start to learn a language later, then you will certainly develop a strong accent. So the mind of young learners is much more flexible as far as language learning is concerned, and has a more holistic approach to all issues that are connected with language use. However, the older you become, the more wired your mind is by the first language, and more difficult to develop any kind of synergism between the new piece of information that comes through the second language tunnel and the existing L1-based information that is in your mind. So definitely when you are older, then the mind becomes more analytic, which means that it is more difficult for you to accept that other people say things in a different way than when you are younger. So definitely age differences are very, very important. The other important thing that we mentioned was motivation, basically. So we have instrumental and integrative motivation. And depending on which motivation affects you, your attitude to the language learning process is different. And the difference between instrumental and integrative motivation is that as far as instrumental motivation is concerned, you want to learn the language for some reason. You want to use it as a tool for some tasks, some things that you want to do in your life. As far as integrative motivation is concerned, it usually happens when you live in another country and you have the desire to integrate into that particular speech community, cultural community. You want to be a member, not only just acquire the language and way of thinking, but also want to be a member of that speech community. So that is something that we call integrative motivation. And definitely, if you have integrative motivation, your language learning process is speeded up significantly. The other differences that we mentioned or may mention here is that, of course, it's very important how much exposure you want to have to the given language and given culture, because that changes individual by individual. So even if you have the opportunity to be in the target language country and exposed to the target language culture, you are the one who actually control that. So it depends on you as an individual, whether you want to emerge in that particular cultural environment or you always want to be some kind of outsider. And the more you want to be immersed in that target language cultural environment, the better the language learning process becomes. Devin, do you have any more questions in connection with this?
Professor, under all the pragmatic skills is mentioned, so I just want to know what is specific.
Pragmatic skills?
Uh-huh.
Yes. So as far as pragmatic skills, these are language use skills. So it's one thing, you know, today we mentioned that it's one thing that you know the structure of the language, you can apply the rules of the language, but it's another thing how you use this knowledge in the actual communicative process. So you actually know what is the preferred ways of saying things and preferred ways of organizing things in that particular language. So we already mentioned that, you know, Americans say, does the furniture, run a business, shoot a photo or something like this. So, you know, there is a particular way how native speakers prefer to express something. And one of the major problems of the second language learner is that the second language learner may not know these may not have these pragmatic skills based on which he or she can identify the figurative meaning of expressions, the situational bound utterances, and the idiomatic expressions that the native speakers use and so on. So the pragmatic skills are connected with the actual use of the language in lifelike situations.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, any more?
I have one more question. It's 5.5 differences between L1 and L2 acquisition.
Yeah, please go there, Han.
Just want to know what is specifically meant by overgeneralization.
Yeah, so so there was overgeneralization, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So the as far as second language learners are concerned, you know, they are intended to overgeneralize certain things that they hear in their environment. So when they hear a particular expression in the environment and they are not necessarily sure what the functional meaning of the expression is, of course, most of the time they make some effort to kind of figure out what the meaning is. And when they find some explanation, they start to use the expression and not thinking about the fact that occasionally it is not necessarily very much appropriate to use the expression. So they think that, you know, people in the speech community use that expression with the same function in most of the speech situations. I can give you an example from my own experience. I think people who have taken my classes may have heard that example, but I think that it's very descriptive as far as overgeneralization is concerned. So when I first came to the United States, I had an interesting experience at the campus of the Brigham Young University, Provo, Utah. And that goes as follows. That was as follows. So, for example, when I was walking to the library, I wanted to find the library, but I didn't know where to go. So I asked one of the students, please tell me how to get to the library. And she says, go straight on, take a left, and then you're gonna hit the library. Well, I said, thank you. And she says, you bet. So that was the first time I heard that when someone says thank you to an American, the American can answer like, you bet. I have never heard that expression before. So I thought that, well, you know, people can respond to thank you this way. So I picked up the expression and started to use that expression. I didn't have much trouble with that until I was in some of the Western states like Montana, Idaho, Utah, and other states. It worked very well. So I made an overgeneralization. How did I find out that that was an overgeneralization? I was invited to Cornell University to the linguistics department to give a presentation. And when I finished my presentation, John Whitman, who is in Japanese linguistics, he was the chair of the session. And John says, Professor Kecskes, thank you very much for this intriguing lecture. And I say, you bet. And everybody started to laugh in the audience, you know. So it was embarrassing because I didn't know why they were laughing. They were laughing because I overgeneralized the use of you bet. So yes, you can use you bet responding to thank you, but not always. And especially not in a situation like that, when you finish a lecture and someone thanks you for the lecture, you don't say you bet. Okay, so that is overgeneralization. Is that clear?
Yes, Professor, thank you very much.
All right. Anything else?
Professor, I have a follow-up question on the use of you bet. I want to know what is the exact context for us to use you bet, because last semester I've heard it from another professor when I say thank you to him for his lecture.
Yeah, but that was that a formal lecture?
It's just a class, like our class.
That's another thing. Yeah, but you know, I was talking about a formal lecture where there were like 150 people or something. So it's not a simple class because, you know, much depends on the relationship between the people who talk. You know, if it was a simple class where there were 10 people present or something, you know, and you regularly meet with that person most of the time, you can say you bet, no problem. However, if you have a formal lecture where there are people who maybe never met you personally, and you have no personal connection with the audience, you know, except that they came to listen to your talk, and then there is a chair of the session there, you know, and someone says, thank you to you, and you say, you bet, everybody will laugh. And that's what happened. So, you know, I realized that in that formal setting, it was a mistake to say you bet.
Okay.
So it depends on the context. It depends on the situation. So after all, that's the important thing as far as overgeneralization is concerned, that expressions, especially formulaic expressions and situation-bound utterances, are tied to particular scenarios, particular situations. And if you use them out of that situation, that might not necessarily be something, you know, that is acceptable. So if it is something, I can give you another example. So it also happened to me a long time ago when I was waiting for one of my Japanese students to come to see me. And when he entered the room, he said, hi, Professor Ketchkish. And I say, hi, Noritaka. And he says, how are you doing? And I say, better than you. You know, better than you is not something that usually people say when they are asked, how are you doing? You know, so that is out of that particular situation. So it is not something, you know, that is actually used in those situations. And especially if you talk to a native speaker and you say something like that, that person is actually or can be confused. And not speaking about a second language learner. The second language learner is even more confused, and as this Japanese student was, because he didn't understand why I said something like that. Okay, any more questions? Looks like I prepared a very good sheet because nobody has any questions. So, you know, probably then we're going to have very good midterm examinations. No questions? Okay, if there are no questions, then we can go to the to my questions, to the worksheet that we want to work on. So please change that and then go there. Okay. So there are three types of different, actually 4 different types of exercises here on this worksheet. And we're going to do as many as we can. I think we have like 12 or 13, quite a number of them. So we had even enough questions and issues here. So there are some questions, direct questions. There are some cases where you actually have a statement and you have to agree or disagree with that. Or there are exercises, cases where you have to decide whether something is true or false based on your studies. And please go down because I want to see the other types. So this, do you agree? Okay. It's true that I already talked about those, but there are some, yeah. Okay, so also I have some cases where you have to actually have to make a decision, selecting something, or case study also. I think I have some situations, yes, some conversations to actually analyze, and utterances where you have to make a decision. So these type of things can come up in the midterm, and they are all connected with what we have discussed in class, or what is basically on the worksheet. So let's start at the beginning where there are some direct questions. Okay, so what are the 4 questions that the field of second language acquisition investigates? So we mentioned 4 different questions when we started the class, and it's also on the worksheet. So everything is on the worksheet and the summary that I gave you 2 weeks ago. So there is nothing new there. If you don't know that, it's better to go home and study, because otherwise you get into trouble as far as the examination is concerned. So what are these 4 questions? Oh, well, that is not very promising that people don't know these 4 questions, although those are the 4 questions that we have been discussing all the time. Han, please go to the other one and show them where they find those 4 questions. Okay. Go up. Okay. At the very beginning. I just want to show you that there is nothing in this worksheet that is not on the summary. So 4 questions of second language acquisition. Uzo already tried to kind of write in, so how are second languages learned, acquired, how do learners create a new system, what exactly does the second language come to know, how do L1 and L2 acquisition relate to each other, and the last one is why are some learners more successful than the others. So these are the 4 questions. Basically, these are the 4 questions that we have been discussing all the time, even today. So please be aware of these 4 questions very much. Please go back to the worksheet. I think the second question is connected with interlanguage. So how would you define what interlanguage is? So what is the definition of interlanguage? How would you define that?
So it's a language created by learners.
Yeah.
Of a second language, which is between the target language and the learner's first language.
Yeah, as far as interlanguage is concerned, it starts out at the point where we have our first language, and it is the more your proficiency is growing, the more you are getting away from the first language, and you develop your interlanguage. The name interlanguage comes from the idea that basically this language is between the first language and the native likeness of the second language. So that's one of the problems, that it images an ideal native likeness that is the goal of the second language acquisition. So you have to get from one point to the other, and what you cover is basically your interlanguage. And there was one very important thing that we emphasized there, please don't forget about that, that interlanguage contains 3 different kind of elements. It contains elements from the first language, it contains elements from the second language, and it contains learner created elements. That's the very important thing, because learners create not only words that do not necessarily exist in the target language, but they create structures, they create pronunciation patterns and all kinds of things, that are individual, and those things do not exist either in their first language or their second language. The next question is nature and nurture. We talked about that at least 2 or 3 different times. So what is the difference between the 2 approaches, nature and nurture? What does that mean? What is this debate all about?
Nature, the nature perspective believes that there's like something innate about how you acquire language and use language. And the nurture side of the debate says that it's all like input and how you're taught the language.
Very good. Yeah, definitely. That is it. Yes. So the nature is about some innate mechanism, and nurture is that there is no innate mechanism, just input, just exposure, and that is something that develops language knowledge. Just think about the emergentism and connectivism that we just talked about in the first part of the class. Thank you. Okay, the next one. Give at least 3 factors on which L1 and L2 development differs. We also talked about the differences between L1 development and L2 development, and we mentioned several factors that are different in the development of the first language and development of the second language. You have to mention at least 3 of them.
I know at least 2, age and metalinguistic awareness.
Yes. Anything else?
Amount of exposure, and L1 linguistic system is already.
Yes. Exposure is also because, you know, I mean, as far as the first language is concerned, you are exposed to the first language all the time. You know, as far as the second language is concerned, that is very limited in comparison to what happens in the first language. Yes. Anything else? Just think about, for example, motivation that we just mentioned, because as far as the first language is concerned, you do not need any kind of motivation there, because you acquire it subconsciously, automatically. As far as the second language is concerned, we just mentioned that it's very important whether you have some kind of instrumental or integrative motivation there. Yes, so there are several factors, you know, so 5 or 6 factors. Just you have to kind of go through that and think about it. What is the difference between motivation and investment? How did we define the difference? Remember, we mentioned that as far as motivation is concerned, that's more like individual, and investment is more like social. So it is sometimes possible that you are not necessarily motivated, but you know cool-headedly that you need to invest into something, and you do that even if you are not motivated, because you know that there must be, or you expect some kind of results as far as the consequences of the investment is concerned. So the motivation is individual, and the investment is more like social. So the social environment, the social circumstances sometimes even require you to do things that you may not necessarily like, but you think that you need to invest energy, money, or effort into something, you know. All right, so let's see the next type of tasks where you have to disagree or agree with something. It's very important that in these cases, you have to give an explanation, no matter what your selection is, whether you agree or disagree with something. I always emphasize that in these cases, everything depends on your explanation, how you explain something, because there are cases when the answer is in between, so you can agree or disagree with something. So everything can be accepted if you explain it properly. So the explanation is crucial here, and not necessarily whether you agree or disagree, but what your argument is for disagreeing with that or agreeing with that, okay? So the first one says, human beings are born with an innate mechanism that makes it possible for them to acquire any human language. Do you agree or disagree? In this case, for example, you can say, I agree, or you can say, I disagree. But if you say, I agree, you can say that, well, you know, I follow the generativists who emphasize that the only reason why human beings can develop any human language because they are pre-wired somehow. So they have some kind of innate mechanism that is triggered after the birth by the environment, and then, you know, they develop the language that is used in that environment. Or you can say that, well, I do not agree with that because, in my opinion, there is no innate mechanism. Everything depends on the exposure. So everything starts after the child is born and exposed to some language use in the environment, okay? So both disagree or agree can be accepted. So the important thing is the explanation, how you explain that, okay? Number 2, learning a language is an acquisition of syntax that that particular language. Your answer. Do you accept that or disagree with that? Yingru.
I disagree, because language refers to the system of signs, which the syntax part of it, but it also includes the learning of the social cultural standard in the specific society, which render the meaning of different like grammatical structures. So
yeah. Yes, all right. So and you can even argue that not every single language has a syntax in the sense that the English language does. You know, so in the English language, syntax is the main driving force. You know, it's in the center of attention because of the word order. So, you know, syntax is connected mainly with the word order as far as English is concerned. But, you know, some of the languages do not necessarily have this kind of syntax that we have, like, you know, Slavic languages or Arabic languages, or even Chinese language has an entire different syntax, you know, that English after all. And you are right, definitely, you know, it doesn't speak about the other side of the language. It's also cultural background knowledge, you know, that is attached to the use of the actual linguistic system. Yes. Number 3. If a child starts to develop a second language at the age of 9, she will acquire this new language the same way as she acquired his first or her first language. We just talked about this, so I don't necessarily want to go through that again. We mentioned, of course, the differences between the two processes. So in this case, for example, there is no answer that would say that I agree with that. You cannot agree with that. So this is something that you can absolutely not agree with. So there is no way to give another answer that I agree with. It would be impossible to find an explanation where you can argue that actually that process is the same, you know? It would be almost impossible. Okay, so the next one, there is much similarity between Krashen's comprehensible input theory and Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. Both emphasize that the student has to be challenged at a slightly higher level of his existing knowledge. This is also something that we already discussed today. Definitely here, but I see here an answer of disagreement as well, because you can argue that as far as comprehensible input is concerned, so the I+1 thing, it's slightly different from what Krashen emphasizes and what Vygotsky emphasizes. Because Vygotsky definitely emphasizes the role of your partners, the teacher, the peers, and so on, who actually help you get from one stage to the other. As far as Krashen is concerned, he emphasizes the quality of the comprehensible input. So not necessarily, the secondary thing is the partners, the peers and the teacher for Krashen. The primary issue is the quality of the comprehensive input here. Okay, so you can argue that way. So I would accept, for example, both approaches. If you said that, definitely I agree, because yes, there is this similarity. But at the same time, if you want to focus on the differences, there are some differences there. Okay. In English, the new information is always expressed at the beginning of the sentence. What do you say about that? Yoonhee, do you agree with that? Yoonhee, do you agree with that?
No, I always thought you opened with old information.
As far as English is concerned, you know, in what way you think that the new information is expressed at the beginning of the sentence? So tell me, explain that you say that old information.
Oh, I'm sorry. Old piece of information is expressed at the beginning of the sentence, I thought, and it's followed by a new piece of information.
Are you sure?
No.
No, yeah, you know, but in English, of course, the new information is there, and then you elaborate on that. So you name the new thing, you know, I mean, this is object usually. And then, you know, you elaborate, so you give information about that. So after all, it's a great difference between English and other languages, especially those languages which have strong morphology, like Finno-Ugric languages, Slavic languages, and some other languages where the new information is at the end of the sentence. In English, the new information is always at the beginning of the sentence. But again, you know, the important thing is that you have to give an example, and through the example, you can kind of argue and you can kind of demonstrate what you think. Okay, let's look at number 7. It's a little bit similar, but still different. So here you have to make a stance that this is false or true. And usually there is just 2 options here, although there might be some cases where the truth is in between somehow. But in these cases, the important thing is that you have to take a stand and you say that this is true or this is false, and you have to explain why you think that this is false or this is true. So here, there is much less gray than in the first case that we just covered. So the first one is social factors such as social class, gender, and ethnicity do not affect the L2 acquisition process significantly. What do you think about that?
I think it's false. Because actually in some of the other classes that I've had, as well as my student teaching experience, we learned about a specific category of L2 English learner. It's called SIFE, S-I-F-E. And it's the student with interrupted formal education. So if the student does not have exposure to formal education, whether because their family was poor or because they were moving around a lot, or because their culture restricts something like women's education, it would significantly affect their ability to learn any subject, but especially another language. Yeah,
you know, and you must remember that we have always emphasized that we cannot necessarily separate language development from social factors. So social factors are always there. The question is to what extent only, and what kind of social factors. But if there is some statement like this that social factors do not affect language acquisition, that's wrong. You know, you cannot say that. So there are several different kinds of social factors. Some of them are present with some individual, the others are present with other individuals. But the point is that there is no language acquisition process with those social factors because they affect the process significantly. Next one, L2 acquisition is very similar to L1 acquisition because language learners go through the same developmental stages and acquire a rule-governed system. So look at this argument. So it's very similar to L1 acquisition because language learners go through the same developmental stages and acquire a rule-governed system. So what do you say about this? Ying-Kong.
Yes, I would say that is L1 acquisition is similar to L1 acquisition only by acquiring a rule-governed system, but they do not share the same kind of development stages. So
yeah,
I disagree.
Yeah, so as far as acquiring a rule-governed system, that's true. You know, that you can agree with that, or that you can say that that's true. But as far as the other half is concerned, it's debatable at least, because you remember that we talked about studies that actually support that language learners go through the same developmental stages, no matter whether they acquire that language as first language, second language, or third language. So it's a question whether you agree with that or not. Definitely the second part is undebatable. So both, no matter what kind of language we are talking about, language learners acquire a rule-governed system. And that rule-governed system is not only about grammar, but even about the use of the language, because we have social rules as well. Okay, so after all, that is undebatable. However, the first part is debatable, depends on whether you accept it or not, you know. So in this case, it is not bad if you mention something like that, you know, that you don't agree with that, but don't think that is true. But there are studies who say that, since we discussed some of these studies. Okay, please go to the next page, Han. Okay, number 7. The most important thing for second language learners is that they receive as much L2 input as possible, and the input should not require them to do what they do not know yet. So the most important thing for second language learners is that they receive as much L2 input as possible, and the input should not require them to do what they do not know yet. What do you think about your statement? Is it true or not? Or Uzo? So do you agree with that, or is it true that it is important that they receive as much L2 input as possible? So far,
the second language learners, they need to get as much input as possible, because their exposure might be different and their cognitive level might also be different. So depending on the case, the case-by-case situation.
How about the second part? The input should not require them to do what they do not know yet.
Sometimes the input might require them to do what they did not know yet, based on maybe it still boils down to a level of exposure as well. If they are more exposed to the inputs, it might trigger a behavior or otherwise.
Okay. All right. Yeah, definitely. How about the next one? Language learning is never just about language. That's an easy one.
Mhm.
Yinglu, what do you think?
Oh, I don't agree. Oh, I agree. Language learning is never just about language. Because language actually is one of the interaction between the cognitive system and the social environment. So learning a language is not just the language itself, it also involves the actual use of language in a given context in a certain culture. So
yeah, right. Okay. How about the next one? There is not much difference between error analysis and contrastive analysis. Both focus on learners' errors. Davindi, do you agree with that? Is it true?
Yes.
You think it's true?
I'm not quite sure, actually.
Yeah, you know, remember we learned about the fact that there is a basic difference between the two. And as far as contrastive analysis is concerned, contrastive analysis says that errors come from the influence of the first language. That's the source of error. So what we have to do is to contrast the two linguistic systems and focus on the differences only, because the learners make errors because of the L1 influence. So they focus on L1 induced errors. As far as error analysis is concerned, that is much broader, because error analysis emphasizes that there are several different kinds of sources of errors in a second language. So, you know, teacher-induced errors, overgeneralization, oversimplification, and all kinds of different sources of errors, you know, that we have to take into consideration if you want to understand how interlanguage develops. So that is this basic difference between the two, that in the case of contrastive analysis, there is only one source of error, the first language. And as far as error analysis is concerned, the actual reason of errors varies, because it can be all kinds of different things, you know, that teacher-induced errors, as I mentioned, overgeneralization, fossilization, and several others. Okay, so let's look at something else, and it is connected with something that we discussed today. So imagine that there are three groups: expressions that have only literal meaning, expressions that have only figurative meaning, and expressions that can have both figurative and literal meaning. So please look at these expressions. They are all well known. So you put each of them into one of these three groups, and you're gonna get like 5 minutes to do that. So the task is to look at these expressions. Be careful, because there is no context. So what comes to your mind is the most important thing. So what you think first, and then you decide whether that is literal or figurative. And then if you think further, if you decided that it's figurative, the question is whether there is a literal meaning as well is associated with that. Then if there are both, then you put it into number 3. If there is only literal, you put it number 1. If you think that there is only figurative, you put it into number 2, okay? So each expression should go into one of these 3 groups, all right? And from now, you can have 5 minutes to do this task. Okay, start. Okay, guys, time is up. All right, so let's go through these expressions and tell me which group you put them. So the first one, they could hardly make both ends meet. First, second, third. Yingru, where did you put it?
I put it in the third group, both literal and figurative meaning.
What is the literal meaning?
Just means make the two ends contact each other, like meet with each other. Like if you have a string in your hand, you can make both ends meet.
So, yeah, okay. Do you agree with her? Is there anyone else who did that in a different way?
Yeah, I thought it was figurative.
Only figurative, yeah? You say Uzo, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Rachel, what do you say?
I said both literal and figurative. Like Yingru said, it could be something you're physically holding, you're trying to make the ends of it meet, and it's not. However, the most common meaning is the figurative meaning, which
Don't
is...
say common, salient, most salient.
Yes.
Figurative. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but you're right, yes. And Yingru was right too, yes. I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Ying Kong.
I put into the third one that is both literal and figurative meaning, because see can be understand as to see something, and also it can mean understand something.
Yeah. All right. Red herring. Yoonhee.
Yes, I said both.
Yeah, so the third group. Yes, you're right. Jim really pissed me off. Davindi.
It's figurative.
Figurative, yes. Well, yeah, you are right. Yes, figurative, definitely. You do not necessarily mean that literary, but you know, in a sense, you can imagine that literary as well, you know, but it would be very ugly. I don't know. Yeah, but absolutely the figurative meaning is the most salient meaning, but I'm a little bit hesitant to say that it is just figurative, you know, because basically you can imagine that in a literal sense as well, although it would be quite ugly. They couldn't put up with you. They couldn't put up with you. Rachel?
For that one, I said only figurative meaning.
Yes.
Because if you take the words by themselves, they're the literal meaning is just nonsense.
Yeah, you're right. Yes. So that is just figurative. Shut up, will you? Uzo.
Okay. It's literal. It's literal.
Yeah, literal, yeah. Do you agree with that? How about the others? Is there any figurative sense in that?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, not to your knowledge, all right. Is there anyone who says that there is some figurative? You know, what makes this is an interesting expression because it can have both a negative and a positive sense as well. You know, because in the literal sense, it means that yes, shut up your mouth and you know, don't say anything. But for example, someone tells his friend that, you know, John, I won $1 million on the lottery. And the guy says, shut up. Oh, shut up. That might be in a figurative sense, I think. Rachel, what do you think as a native speaker?
I think it could be both, both literal and figurative.
Yeah.
It's like you could be physically shutting something, or you could just be saying, you know, be quiet, no way.
Okay, no way, yes.
Yeah.
Because that's the figurative sense, no way, yeah. Hot stuff. Jingao.
Both literal and figurative.
Yeah, yeah, that was easy, yes. Dead end. Dead end. Yoonhee, what do you think about dead end?
I said both.
Both. In what tell me an example for a literal sense.
Literally, when you come to you're driving, you come to a dead end and you have to drive back to get out. That's dead end.
But that's figurative, isn't it? Because the end is not dead. I mean, it is figuratively used that. So when you say that there is no way out of your driveway or something, you know, dead end.
Right.
But is there any way to use that in literary? I don't think. I don't. Sorry, figuratively. This is just, yeah.
When you're like, you hear if you're a detective and you're following, you're following some kind of evidence to, I don't know, track down somebody, and then it leads to nothing, then you could say, oh, it was dead end.
Oh, okay. It's interesting. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes. That's basically, that's true. Yeah. Okay. Shoot the breeze.
Yeah.
Yeah. What? So both figurative or just figurative?
Am I still talking? Isn't shoot the breeze just
I'm asking the group, you know, so whoever. Oh, yeah. Yingru, what do you think?
I chose two, only figurative meaning.
Figurative, only figurative, yes. How about smoking gun? Van.
I guess both.
Yes.
I'm not sure.
There is no doubt about that. Miss the boat. Uzo, miss the boat.
Yeah, I wrote both. It's
yes.
both literal and figurative.
Yeah. How about the last one? Old fart.
I said both for the last one. Because
definitely.
Figuratively, it just means someone old, but literally it could just mean something really, really smelly.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Good. Next one. Is Jane's last sentence correct in English? So here is a conversation between Mary and Jane. Mary says, I need to send a package to my mother in a hurry. Sorry, that's a mistake there. Jane, where does she live? Mary, in New York. Jane, oh, in that case, John can take it. John is traveling to New York tomorrow. So look at the last sentence of Jane and tell me whether this is correct English or not. So, oh, in that case, John can take it. John is traveling to New York tomorrow. Is there anything wrong with that expression?
I don't see anything wrong in the expression because there's a conversation going on here and it's within a context. So when Jane says John can take it, it's about a package that both the discussant already are aware of. So Jane uses it to explain the package in this last sentence.
Yeah.
And there's an agreement and understanding that since John lives in New York and John is traveling tomorrow, then Jane shouldn't, Mary shouldn't bother that John will take it as he travels. So I think it's correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. The next one is a little bit more complicated. Number 10. Do you think that the narrator who says this sentence is a native speaker? If yes, why? If no, why? So please read the sentence very carefully. The tornado that ran through Pinellas County in Wednesday was the most powerful one which hit the area in around 3 decades. So the tornado that ran through Pinellas County in Wednesday was the most powerful one which hit the area in around 3 decades. What do you say about that? Is this a native speaker who said this sentence or not? And why?
I think it's a non-native speaker saying this sentence because they use prepositions incorrectly.
Yes.
Like on Wednesday would be the correct form. It might not be grammatically correct, but I would say the most powerful tornado that hit the area. And I would say about 3 decades, not around.
Okay. Yes, definitely. All right. So next one, please, Han, please pull down the page. Okay, we will go to that at the end because we have restricted time and I want to finish the other two. So go to 11, number 11. Yeah, here. Okay. Explain the difference between overextension and underextension in child language. So we talked about that when we discussed first language acquisition, that children often overextend something or underextend something. What does that mean? Yingkong, what do you think?
I think, for example, if children raise a dog, then he or she will just refer any animals as the term dog is kind of overextension. For underextension, that means, for example, the child raise a dog, and he just a kind of dog, but he refers to this kind of dog as dog, but others as anything else. So it's kind of end extension. Right.
All right, definitely. Good. How about the VOOC test? So what is the VOOC test and what was it good for? You remember also when we talked about the first language, we mentioned the VOOC test. And that was a very important test. But what was that good for? You remember what it was? Davindi.
So it proved that children can apply underlying rules to live exemplars. And it proved that children are able to do more than just simply producing rote imitation and utterances.
Yes, very good. Yes, so after all, that was a good proof. You remember that we talked about the ED, the past tense form, how it is acquired by children, or native speaker children. And we said that in the first phase, the native speaker children use the past tense form as if they were separate lexical items. Like they don't see the connection between give and gave, do and did, or open or opened, but each of them are separate linguistic or lexical units for them. And then they notice that basically the process is rule governed. So most of the cases, the ed is used to form the past tense, and they overgeneralize that. So what happens is that they produce utterances like goed and dood and so on. And the third stage is when they recognize that there are irregular forms, but in most of the cases, of course, the ed form is used as an underlying rule. Okay, so the next one is quite interesting. So the question is, how would you describe the learning context in the following case? Do you think Ollie learned any English? So how would you describe the learning context in the following case? Do you think Ollie learned any English? Please read the text very carefully and then answer it. You're gonna get a couple of minutes, okay? So read the text and tell me whether you think that Ollie learned any English, and how would you characterize the learning context? Okay, so from now, 2 minutes. Okay, time is up. So tell me what you think about this situation. What you think about Ollie's learning English? Ingrid, what do you think?
I think he's learning English. He's learning English through like a passive socialization instead of in a classroom setting. Because he didn't go to school, and he spent most of the time in the store and only listen and watch the customers talk to each other, but he didn't talk to any of them. That's I think he's still in the input phase, and he haven't actually started practicing his spoken language yet. So I call it like passive socialization.
Okay, so he's passively exposed. And what else can you add to that? Because there are several important things here that's going on. Generally, what you said is okay. Yeah.
Yeah, given his age, I think the second language learning process will be a little bit easier because he's at the age of 8 and he's at universal grammar. The innate system still works for him. And I think he could develop the second language in their way. According to class theory, that they need to experience some period of like passive input. And then when the intake is enough, and he will be able to generate the utterances in the second language. I think it works for him in this condition, given his age.
Okay. Any other factors that are important? So Yingru talked about the passive learning environment. She talked about the age, but are there any other important elements in this text that show or say something about the acquisition process?
Professor, can we say it's like a naturalistic context?
Yes, definitely. It's naturalistic, absolutely. And there is something else that you can relate to an issue that we discussed today. So if you look at the last sentence, it says, he watched customers and listened to their conversations with each other and the shopkeeper. So it's very important that he was listening to them, you know, so he was noticing things in the input there. So he was not just a passive person, you know, who was exposed to the second language just because there was nothing else, you know, but that environment for him, but he was actually listening to them. So after all, listening means some kind of noticing, you know, because definitely, although there is no information about that, but the fact that he watched them and listened to them and listened to their conversation, listened to how they conversed with each other, you know, that might have helped his language acquisition process quite a bit. So this kind of task could be also in the examination, where you get a particular situation, and based on the situation, you have to kind of apply what you have learned and explain what's going on there. Of course, noticing is also important for you as well, what you notice in the text and what you can relate in the text to what you have learned, okay? We still have 5 minutes, so if you have any questions, this is your last occasion, last opportunity to ask questions.
Professor, I have a question about in our worksheet, the second one is interlanguage. That is, you mentioned about the nature versus nurture, and also there are some terms you said as they all refer to the same phenomenon. I noticed there's another term that is a nativism. Does nativism equals to the other terms like language acquisition device, universal grammar, innate ability, or innate mechanism?
Well, nativism is not used in connection with the nature and nurture dichotomy. Nativism is occasionally, you can find it in some writings that, but you know, usually people rarely mention that because this is a confusing expression since there is not clearly defined what is meant by nativism. Definitely it is used occasionally, you know, to denote the innate mechanism. So it is on that side of the matter, the nature side of the matter. Anything else?
Professor, I have a question between the relationship of interlanguage foreigner talk and lingua franca. Does interlanguage include foreigner talk and lingua franca? And the lingua franca is like a system of a language.
Well, lingua franca is about the use of the language. Interlanguage is about the system of the language. Okay, so these are two different things. Interlanguage always refers to more like the grammatical structure, the development of the grammatical structure of the language. When we talk about lingua franca is a language use mode, as I define it. You know, it's a language use mode basically, because lingua franca is when people talk who use a language that is not the first languages of any of them. You know, so that's the lingua franca situation. It's strictly about language use. So there is no lingua franca structure. As far as interlanguage is used by scholars and people who studied interlanguage is it's the system of the language that develops. It's another problem that we could argue, but I can tell you I don't know about studies that argue that way, that interlanguages also should include not only the linguistic system, you know, but what is beyond the linguistic system. But this is not what Salinger and his followers did. So interlanguage is strictly used to refer to the developing linguistic system.
Okay, thank you.
Any more? If there is nothing more, then we can kind of finish today. So you didn't have many questions. That means that you either didn't read the summary very carefully, or you know everything. So, you know, the summary was very clear, and basically there is no problem in there. I tried to cover all the most important things in the worksheet that we just completed. So I hope that helped a little bit. And I also kind of gave you some idea about the type of questions that you may have in the examination. But as I promised, basically, you can do the exam in 50 minutes. We will start sharply at 4:30, so please be on time and don't be late, because on 4:30 I start to speak. I start to kind of explain all the tasks that will be on your examination sheet, and then you will left alone. You will be left alone, and you will be able to work on the questions on your own. And you're going to get 90 minutes to finish it. So that will be absolutely enough for you to do the task. So you shouldn't be worried about time. What you should be worried about is the worksheet that you, I think, have to go through again, you know, before the examination, because it's very important that you should be familiar with all the issues and information that is on the sheet. All right, guys, so thank you for your participation today, and I hope that we have been able to go through all the important things that we wanted to. So thank you and good night.
Thanks, Professor. Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye. See you next week.